Hello, I'm Brad from Overseas Aero Tours. We fly a vintage Waco biplane here at the Marathon Airport and take people on tours of the area. You'll see a little bit about the geography and the history and the wildlife that is here in the Florida Keys. I was always interested in becoming a pilot, but living in the Florida Keys, the opportunities were kind of limited. You didn't have much of a chance. I lived in Key Largo, so it was about an hour either direction to get to an airport. And I saw an ad in the local newspaper about pilot ground school at the community college, and that was back in, I think, 1988. So I started taking the ground school, and the instructor also had an airplane up at Tamiami Airport in South Miami. So it being only an hour away, I started driving up there and taking flying lessons, and sooner or later it turned into, instead of running dive boats and fishing boats for a living, I ended up flying airplanes for a living. Stayed here in the Keys. The trouble with trying to fly for a living is that it takes quite a few hours before you can get any kind of a job or qualify for insurance to fly people commercially. So after Hurricane Andrew wiped out my instructor's airplanes in Tamiami back in 1992, the instructor was a buddy of mine by that time, and we put a seaplane on my beach in Tavernier. So having a seaplane on the beach right in your backyard, that allowed me to get enough hours in so that eventually I could get enough hours and actually get a job flying airplanes. That came into being when a guy needed a pilot to fly a seaplane over in the Bahamas, and it was easier to get a low-time pilot on his insurance than it was to teach a high-time pilot how to catch a bonefish. So after finally accumulating enough hours to become a commercial pilot and get a job flying something for a living instead of running boats, that sort of morphed into several different jobs here in the Keys, flying seaplanes out to Dry Tortugas and to different resorts. And then when this position of having a biplane here at the Marathon Airport became available, we put this in here about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's just amazing the response we've had. Everybody that gets out of the plane steps off talking about it's almost life-changing. It's the highlight of their trip to the Keys, because you just see so much that you can't see driving up and down the highway or even from a boat. So getting up in the air and looking down on it all just gives you a great overall perspective of what we actually have here in the Florida Keys, and that you actually are on an island. You know, until you get up and look down on it, you don't realize how surrounded by water we actually are. This plane's a Waco UPF-7. It was built in 1940, and it's part of the aircraft fleet that the United States government put together so that they could train the vast number of pilots they needed in World War II. This airplane has a 220 horsepower Continental engine. It's also the same engine everybody's heard of a Stearman biplane. They've got the same engine, and this motor was also used in World War II in the Sherman Army tank. So the motor itself's got quite a history behind it. But these airplanes at the time in World War II would have a pilot instructor in the back and a student pilot in the front. And part of the amazing stuff with these airplanes is when you buy them, you've still got the 1940 logbooks that explain about all the different mishaps that these planes had while they were training pilots back in the 1940s. One of the most rewarding things that you get flying these old World War II trainer aircraft is occasionally we still get some old guy coming through the fence that actually flew this stuff in World War II, trained in this stuff, and there's not very many of them left. They're all getting pretty old, but we still get the occasional one that can climb up in the airplane. We had one event where we had a lot of the World War II WASP. Those are the Women's Air Service pilots. And the youngest one was like 84 years old, and almost all of them could still jump up in the airplane, hop right in the pilot's seat. And it's like they remembered it as it was yesterday. They were saying, oh yeah, I remember this airplane had this characteristic or that characteristic. And so that's one of the most rewarding things you can have, is seeing some of these veterans from World War II that actually flew this stuff before they went to combat. And if you'd like more information, you can check out Overseas Aero Tours on the internet, or you can call the number on the screen. We'll be glad to answer your questions.